Marlene Kovak had run the number 4 press at Ashford Stamping for 22 years. She knew its sound the way you know a person breathing in the next room. So the morning she walked in and found the steel guard she'd bolted onto that machine with her own hands lying in the scrap barrel, cut loose to shave 2 seconds off a cycle, she knew exactly what it meant. She didn't argue on the floor. She didn't raise her voice. She took out a pencil and she wrote it down. She wrote it down, and it went up the line, and Harlan Voss took her report, the one that named the exact machine, the exact danger, the exact thing that would happen if nobody put that guard back on, and he dropped it in the wastebasket. Right there, in front of the receiving clerk and 2 men on their break. Paper doesn't run the press. Kovak. 3 people watched it land. The state man was coming Thursday. Voss thought a clean floor and a fresh pot of coffee would handle him. He never once asked what Marlene might do with 14 minutes alone on the line. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, this story is for you. Before I go on, subscribe and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Now, let me take you back and tell it right. Kettle Falls, Ohio, autumn of 1971. The kind of town where the whole day runs on one whistle. When the 7 o'clock blew at Ashford Stamping Works, the diner emptied, the parking lot filled, and 300 people walked in under a roof that had been shaking presses since before most of them were born. The building smelled like cutting oil and cold metal and coffee that had been on the burner too long. It was not a pretty place. But it was an honest one, most days, and the people inside it took a certain plain pride in that. Marlene Kovak had been walking in under that roof for 22 years. She was 54 now, wide through the shoulders, gray coming in at the temples, hands that had stopped being soft sometime around the Eisenhower administration. The floor called her Mars. Not because she was hard, though she could be. They called her Mars because when something went wrong on that floor, a jammed die, a green kid about to lose a hand, a setup that looked fine and wasn't. She was the fixed point everybody turned toward. Steady, always in the same place. You could navigate by her. She'd married a machinist, buried a machinist, and taught half the men on that floor everything they knew about staying alive around a machine that did not care whether they lived. Number 4 was hers, a big mechanical stamping press, the kind that comes down with tons of force and does not ask twice. You fed it steel, and it gave you a shaped part, and if you were careless, it would give the part your fingers along with it. That was why, back in '68, after a scare that still woke her some nights, she had built the guard herself. A point-of-operation guard. Steel, bolted, simple, it sat between a man's hands and the place where the ram came down. She'd fabricated it on her own time, painted it, mounted it, and wired in the palm buttons so the press wouldn't cycle unless both your hands were flat on the controls, nowhere near the die. 2 hands on the buttons. No hand in the press. That was the whole idea. That was the whole point. She was proud of it, and she never said so. She just checked it. Every shift, before she checked her own setup, she walked the line and checked everybody else's. The young ones rolled their eyes when her back was turned. And they let her do it, because every man on that floor had at some point watched Mars catch a mistake that would have cost somebody a hand, and nobody rolls their eyes forever. The one she watched closest was Danny Corso, 19, an apprentice she'd taken on because his hands were good, and because his father was gone, and because, though she would never have put it this way, the boy reminded her of the man she'd married 30 years back. Danny had been her late husband's kind of kid. Quick, eager, a little too sure of himself. She trained him the way she'd been trained. Slow, repeat it till it's boring. Then repeat it again. The machine's patient, she told him. It'll wait your whole life for you to get lazy one time. He grinned when she said it. He was 19. He thought lazy was a thing that happened to other people. That autumn, Everything at Ashford changed, and the reason it changed had a dollar figure on it. $380,000. The plant had landed a stamping order for Delmark Tractor, brackets and mounting plates, thousands of them, on a tight run. 30 days to deliver. It was the biggest single order the shop had seen in years, and everybody understood what it meant. It meant the plant would keep its lights on through the winter. It meant, if it went right, that the owners downstate might send more work north instead of shipping it somewhere cheaper. A whole town's worth of Christmas was riding on that press line, running clean and running fast. And there was Harlan Voss, standing in the middle of it, plant manager, holding the 30-day clock like it was his own heartbeat. Voss was not a cruel man in the way people imagine cruel men. He wore a tie, he shook hands, he remembered the names of your kids. He believed sincerely that he was a reasonable person doing a hard job, and that the people who slowed him down were the unreasonable ones. He had come up on the office side, not the floor side, and to him the floor was a set of numbers that had to hit a target. Cycle time. Parts per hour. Days remaining. He did not hear the press breathing. He heard the clock. So when the numbers didn't add up, when the math said the guarded presses could not make Delmark's schedule at the speed they were running, Voss did what men like Voss do. He looked for the 2 seconds. And he found them in the guards. Here is the thing about that guard, the thing Voss knew and chose not to weigh. With the palm button system live, an operator had to bring both hands down flat every cycle before the ram would drop. That's a beat. A half second of hands finding their place, times 1,000 cycles, times 3 presses, times 30 days. Pull the guard, bypass the buttons, let a man single cycle the machine with a foot pedal and one hand free, and you buy back your seconds. You also put that free hand a few inches from a place that will take it clean off. Voss knew the first part cold. The second part he filed under acceptable, the way a man files a thing he does not intend to look at again. He gave the order on a Tuesday. Pull the palm button guards on 3 presses. Number 4 was one of them. Marlene found out the way she found out most things, by walking the line before her shift. She came around the end of number 4, with her coffee still in her hand, and she stopped. The guard was gone. Not broken. Not jammed. Gone. And when she looked, she didn't have to look far. It was in the scrap barrel by the die racks, the barrel where the trim waste and the busted tooling went, the barrel that got hauled to the smelter. Her guard. The steel she'd cut and bent and painted. Somebody had taken a wrench to her bolts and thrown 3 years of her careful work in with the garbage. She stood there a moment. Just a moment. Then she set down her coffee, reached into the barrel, and fished it out. She wiped the oil off it with a shop rag. She carried it to her toolbox at the end of the line, and she laid it in the bottom, under the tray, and she said one thing to nobody in particular: dry, as a dead battery. No sense letting good steel rust. Then she closed the lid, and she went to work. She did not know, laying that guard in her toolbox, that she was loading a weapon. She thought she was being thrifty. She thought, maybe, that when the Delmark job was done and sanity returned, she'd bolt it back on herself. That's all. A habit of a woman who did not waste things. But the guard was in her box now, and it would stay there. And there is a whole world of difference between a piece of steel in a scrap barrel headed for the smelter and a piece of steel in the hands of the person who made it. She'd just moved it from one to the other, without quite noticing. Warning number 1 went out that same shift, and it went out loud in the only place it was ever going to count, on the floor, out of her mouth. She found Otis Lund by the tool crib. Otis was the night foreman, an old ally, a man who'd been at Ashford almost as long as she had. Careful to a fault. He had a pension coming, and he loved that pension the way some men love a dog, and he had spent 30 years learning exactly how much he could say and to whom. Otis. She didn't waste words with Otis, he didn't like them wasted. The guards are off 3 presses. Mine's in the scrap. Otis looked at her, and then he looked at the floor, and then he looked back at her. I heard. Somebody's going to get hurt on number 4. I'm telling you now so that when it happens, you heard me say it before, and not after. Otis was quiet, a long moment. He had a logbook under his arm, the maintenance logbook, the one where every repair and change on every machine got a date and an initial. He was the kind of man who filled it out because that was the rule, and he followed rules. I'll note the change in the book, he said finally. That's what I can do. It sounded like caution. It sounded like a man protecting himself. Neither of them knew yet that Otis Lund quietly writing the date down in a logbook, out of nothing but 30 years of habit, was the second most important thing that happened in that plant, all autumn. Marlene nodded. You do that. And that was warning 1. Verbal, 1 witness. Written nowhere but a place she couldn't see. She didn't leave it there. That wasn't her way. Marlene believed, and this was the thing she was going to have to unlearn, though she didn't know it yet. Marlene believed that the truth, written down and handed to the right person, was enough. That paper was how you made a thing real and permanent. She'd been raised on it. Get it in writing. Keep your copies. A written record was a wall nobody could move. So warning number 2. She typed. She went to the little office off the break room where the operators filled out their forms, and she rolled a sheet into the machine, and she wrote a memo, clean and plain. Machine number 4. Guard removed. Palm button safety bypassed. Single cycle operation now possible with an operator's hand inside the point of operation. She was specific. She named the hazard the way a nurse names a symptom. No drama, just the fact of it. She typed it up the line to Voss, and she made herself a carbon copy, because that's what you did, and she filed the carbon in her own drawer at home that night like a person putting money in a safe. Lund was standing right there when she pulled the memo out of the typewriter. He read it over her shoulder without being asked. That's the machine, he said. That's the exact machine. She said, I know it is. 2 warnings now. The paper was starting to stack. Nothing came back down. No answer. No meeting. The presses kept running fast and the parts kept coming, and the Delmark count on the whiteboard in Voss's office kept ticking down. And up front, that was the only number anybody was reading. Which brought her to warning number 3. And warning number 3 she did not type quietly and file. Warning number 3 she made formal. There was a near miss on number 4 on a Thursday. Not Danny. A different man. A hand that came a hair too close on a single cycle and felt the wind of the ram come down where his fingers had been a half second before. He walked away white. He walked away whole. And Marlene, who was 3 feet away and saw the whole thing, decided that near was close enough to write like it was a hit. She filed a formal near-miss report. Company form. The real kind. The kind that was supposed to go in a permanent file. The kind that existed precisely so that a company could prove it had been warned. Machine number. Date. Time. The man's name. The hazard, the fix. She walked it up to the front herself. She found Voss by the receiving dock. He was standing with a clipboard, talking Delmark counts with the receiving clerk, and there were 2 men from the floor a few feet off, sitting on a bench, eating out of lunch pails on their break. Marlene held the report out to him. Voss took it. He glanced at it. Maybe 2 seconds. And then, without heat, almost gently, the way you'd toss a losing ticket, he dropped it in the wastebasket beside the clerk's desk. Paper doesn't run the press, Kovak, he said. The press runs the press. And right now, the press has got 22 days to save all our jobs. So let's you and me both do ours. He said it reasonably. He said it like the sensible man he believed himself to be. Then he went back to his clipboard. The clerk looked at the wastebasket. The two men on the bench had stopped chewing. 3 people watched that report go in the trash, and Marlene watched all 3 of them see it, and something in her went very still and very quiet. Not angry. Quieter than angry. She looked at the wastebasket, and then she looked at Voss's back, and she thought. And she would tell people later this was exactly the thought, word for word, she thought. All right. So paper isn't enough. Then I'll find something that is. She turned around and walked back to number 4. That was the last warning. 3 of them. Now, spoken, typed, filed, and trashed, and every one of them ignored. The account was open, and it had witnesses. The bill came due 9 days later on a Saturday double shift, and it came due on Danny Corso. She wasn't going to tell this part in a way that made you flinch. There's no need. But you have to know it happened, because everything after turns on it. Danny had picked up the double because he was saving for something, a car probably, the way 19-year-olds do. And because the overtime was there, and the plant was desperate to make the count. 14 hours in, on the guardless number 4, tired the way you get tired when you've stopped noticing you're tired, he single-cycled the press wrong. 1 motion out of 1,000. Done a little too fast, a little too loose. A hand where a hand should never have been able to be. The way the machine had been patiently waiting for, all along. The press came down. And then the line stopped. All of it. Every machine. Because when a man screams like that on a shop floor, every operator's hand hits the stop by instinct, and for 1 long second, the loudest place in Kettle Falls went completely silent, except for the one sound. Marlene reached him first. Of course she did. She was the fixed point. Everybody turned toward her, and she turned toward him. She had him wrapped and pressed, and she was talking to him low and steady, the same voice she used to teach him, telling him he was all right. He was going to be all right. Keep your eyes on me, Danny. Keep your eyes right here on me. While somebody ran for the phone and somebody else stood frozen and useless. The ram had taken the tips of 2 fingers. 2 fingers of a boy who wanted to spend his life working with his hands. The ambulance came. They took him out through the big door, and the floor stood there in a silence that had a completely different quality than the working quiet. A shamed silence. A silence with a question in it. And every man in it knew the question, and knew the answer, and looked at the scrap barrels, and looked away. Here is the part that told Marlene exactly what kind of fight she was in. The containment started that same hour, not the next day. That same hour, while Danny's blood was still on the floor of the press. Voss came down from the office, pale. She'd give him that, genuinely rattled. But even rattled, the machine in his head was already running. She heard the phrases before the ambulance was off the property. Operator error. Fatigue, a man on a double, working too fast, taking a shortcut he knew better than to take. It would go in Danny's file that way. Operator error. The 2 words that end an apprentice's trade and clear the plant of everything in 1 stroke. 19 years old, and about to be filed as a warning to others. And then she watched the second thing, and the second thing was worse than the first, because the first was a lie, and the second was a confession. Within the hour, with Danny not yet at the hospital, a maintenance man was down at number 4, with a wrench and the show guard, bolting a palm button guard back onto the machine. Not her guard, a different one, pulled from stores. But bolting it on, right there, making the machine look the way it was supposed to look, the way it had been required to look the whole time. Making it presentable. Voss stood and watched it go on, and did not see what he was admitting by putting it there. If the machine needed a guard now, it had needed a guard an hour ago. He was reattaching the exact thing whose absence had just cost a boy 2 fingers, and he was doing it to protect a schedule, and he thought he was cleaning up. Marlene stood at the end of the line, oil and worse on her sleeves, and watched them bolt that guard on, and she did not say a word. She was learning something in that moment, and it was a cold thing to learn at 54. She was learning that she had been wrong about paper her whole life. She'd thought the written truth was a wall. But Voss controlled the files. Her formal report was in a wastebasket. Her memo was up the line where it could quietly disappear. Her carbon copy at home meant nothing against a man who could produce 3 documents saying black was white and file them all in the permanent record. Paper was only as strong as the hand that held the drawer. And the hand that held the drawer was Harlan Voss's. The days after were their own kind of grind. The company doctor. The workers' comp forms, which somebody would need Danny to sign, forms that had that phrase built into them like a nail in a board, operator error, contributing negligence, the language that would follow the boy from job to job for the rest of his life, and make sure no other shop trusted his hands. Marlene visited him. He was small in the hospital bed, and scared under the brave face, and the first thing he said to her, the very first thing, was that he was sorry. Sorry, like it was his shortcut. Like the guard had been on and he'd defeated it, instead of the truth, which was that there'd been nothing there to defeat. She held his good hand, and she told him he had nothing to be sorry for. And she meant it so hard it came out almost like anger, and she made him a promise she wasn't sure yet how she'd keep. "You're going to run that press again," she said, "certified, with your name clean. You hear me? You're going to run it." He didn't believe her. She could see he didn't. That was all right. She believed enough for both of them. She thought about the carbon copy in her drawer at home. Thought about marching it into the owners, downstate. And she understood, thinking it through the way she thought through a bad setup, exactly why it wouldn't work. It was a piece of paper. Voss would have 3 pieces of paper. It was her word, an angry old operator with a grudge, against the reasonable man in the tie who remembered your kids' names. The buried report wasn't just buried. It was now inconvenient enough that Voss would make sure it stayed buried for good, and any copy she waved would just look like the desperate move it was. Paper against paper, she lost. She'd always lose. Because he owned the ground the paper stood on. So she stopped thinking about paper. That was the turn, right there, though it didn't look like much from outside. A woman running a press, not saying anything, thinking. The pain in her had cooled and set into something else. Resolve isn't loud. Real resolve is one of the quietest things there is. And then, on a Tuesday, she overheard the piece that changed the shape of everything. She was refilling her coffee outside the front office, and the door was open a crack, and Voss was on the phone. And she caught it. The state was sending a man. A factory inspector, under the new law. There was a new federal safety law that year, teeth in it that the old rules never had, and it meant an inspector could walk into a plant like Ashford and actually look. His name was Teller. Raymond Teller. He was coming Thursday. And she heard Voss's plan for him, too, because Voss said it right into the phone like it was the most natural thing in the world. Clean the aisles. Get the guards on, all of them, make sure every press looks right. Fresh coffee, a good breakfast spread up in the conference room. Walk him slow. Walk him friendly. Keep him up front and full of pastry. Show him a floor that runs like a Swiss watch. Sign whatever he puts in front of you. Shake his hand, send him home. Manage him. Voss actually used that word. We'll manage him. Marlene stood in the hall with her coffee going cold, and she felt the whole thing turn over in her chest and click into place like a die seating home. Because Voss's plan had a hole in it the size of a shop door, and the hole was this: he was going to show Teller a floor. A staged floor. A quiet, clean, guards on, everybody on their best behavior floor. He was going to hand a state inspector a version of the truth. Dressed up, the same way he handed the owners a version on paper. And that would work, that would absolutely work, on a man who let himself be handed things. But Marlene had just spent a week learning that the thing she'd trusted her whole life, the handed-over document, could be controlled and buried and dressed up by whoever owned the files. And the flip side of that lesson, the thing that came with it, was the way out. There was one kind of truth Harlan Voss could not control, could not bury, could not restage, could not manage. Not a truth you handed a man on paper, a truth a man saw with his own two eyes, in person, standing in front of the machine while it ran. You couldn't file that in a drawer, you couldn't drop that in a wastebasket. Once it was in a man's eyes, it was in the world for good. She thought about the guard in the bottom of her toolbox, under the tray, wrapped in a shop rag. She thought about Otis Lund's logbook, the one where a careful man had written down a date because it was the rule. She thought about Danny's comp form, still unsigned. That phrase still sitting in it, waiting to end him. And Marlene Kovak, who had filed 3 warnings and watched every one of them ignored, made herself a plain decision. And she said it later just this dry, so I decided I wouldn't hand anyone a piece of paper. I'd hand them the machine. She didn't confront Voss. She didn't go for the carbon copy. She did something much quieter and much harder to stop. She started arranging to be standing in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, on Thursday. For the 14 minutes, she now knew Voss would be pulled up front, welcoming his inspector with coffee and a handshake and a staged floor, believing he had managed the whole thing. She just had to make sure that when Raymond Teller finally reached the floor, he reached it her way. On foot. The short way. Past number 4. While it was running, she caught Otis Lund at the tool crib that night, and she kept her voice down, and she kept it plain, because plain was the only language that ever moved Otis. Thursday, she said. The state man. Voss is going to keep him up front and walk him slow. Otis's face didn't change, but his eyes did. He knew that voice of hers. I'm going to bring him down myself, she said. The short way. A long silence. Then, quiet. There's just one thing I'd need from you, Otis, and it's the truth, so it shouldn't cost you a thing. She looked at the logbook under his arm. Don't lose that book. Otis Lund stood there with his pension in his mind and his crew in his heart, 30 years of careful weighing right behind his eyes. He looked at the book under his own arm like he'd never really seen it before. And then he looked back at Mars, and something in the old man settled. When'd they pull that guard, Marlene? He asked, though he already knew. What's the date say? She held his eyes. You tell me. You wrote it. Otis opened the book, right there, and turned to the page and ran a thick finger down to the line in his own careful hand. He read the date to himself. His lips moved. Then he closed the book, slow, and he tucked it back under his arm, and he did not say he would help her. What he said was, 41 days. Then he walked back toward his crew, and the shop lights buzzed overhead, and somewhere in the dark end of the building number 4 sat cold and waiting, wearing a guard bolted on for show-over buttons that weren't even wired, and Thursday was 2 days away. And not one soul up in that front office had the first idea that the quiet woman on press 4 had already read all the way down to the fine print. Thursday came in gray. It came in cold. Marlene got to the floor an hour early, the way she always did, and she checked every man's setup before her own. She checked Danny's old station out of habit, though Danny wasn't on it. She checked the palm buttons on number 4 with 2 fingers, the way you check a stove you already know is off. Bolted on. Dead underneath. She'd known that for days. She checked it anyway. Then she went to work like it was any Thursday in her life. That was the hardest part. Not the plan. The waiting inside the plan. She ran the Delmark order all morning, blank after blank, the ram coming down and the part coming out, and she kept her face the same as it had been for 22 years. Voss walked the floor at 9. She didn't look up. He stopped near the front presses, hands in his pockets, checking his own staging like a man admiring a set table. Clean aisles, fresh paint on the guard rails, a pot of coffee up in the office already going. He walked the line the day before, too, that had been the near thing. She'd been at the wash sink when she heard him tell the maintenance kid to pull the show guard off number 4 early. "It slows the cycle," Voss had said. "Put it back Thursday before he gets here." And Marlene had felt the whole thing tip. If that guard came off now, and the inspector never saw it bolted on at all, her whole quiet trap lost its teeth. She needed Teller to see the lie wearing its Sunday clothes. She needed him to see the guard that looked right and wasn't. So she'd done the thing that turned her stomach. She'd walked over, calm as milk, and she'd fed the man his own vanity. "Leave it on, Harlan," she'd said. "You want him to see a guarded floor, don't you? Take it off now, and some sharp-eyed state boy notices bare bolt holes. Leave it. Looks better." Voss had looked at her a second too long. For one bad beat she thought he saw all the way through her. Then he'd nodded, slow, pleased with himself, because a man like that only ever hears the part that flatters him. "Good thinking, Kovak," he'd said. "See, you keep quiet, you're useful." And he'd walked off, and she'd stood there with her hands in the gray wash water and let them shake where nobody could see. Now it was Thursday, and the guard was still on, and the buttons under it were still dead, and the coffee was still hot up front. Everything was where she'd set it. Raymond Teller came through the office door at 10 past 10. She saw him the way you see weather coming. A man in a plain suit, a leather case under his arm, a badge he didn't bother to show around. Not young, not soft. He had the look of somebody who'd been managed before and had learned the shape of it. The coffee and the slow walk and the sudden urgent problem up front that eats the clock. Voss met him with his hand out and his best voice on. "Mr. Teller, long drive. Come on up, let me get you a cup, walk you through our numbers before we go down." And Teller went. Of course he went. You don't refuse the coffee in the first minute, that's not how it's done. Up the stairs, into the glass office, the door closing on the two of them. Marlene looked at the clock over the time clock. 14 minutes. Maybe less. That was the welcome. That was the pitch. The safety record folder. The slow warm-up before Voss would bring him down and steer him past the front presses, and never once let him near the dark end of the building where number 4 ran the Delmark order under a guard that was all show. She left her press running, and she walked to the back, and she found Otis Lund by the tool crib, and the logbook was under his arm. "He's here," she said. Otis nodded. He didn't say anything. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were tired, and 30 years of caution sat on him like a wet coat. But the book was there. He'd carried it up from the night side just for this, and he was standing where he said he'd stand. "When it's time," Marlene said, "you'll know." "I'll know," said Otis. She went back to her line. She waited. She counted the ram strokes because counting kept her hands steady. And at 8 minutes past the door had closed, she saw the office door open at the top of the stairs, and she moved. Not fast. She never went fast. Fast is what people remember. She just walked, an operator crossing her own floor, and she came up the stairs light, and she caught Teller in the little landing before Voss could get around the desk. Voss still gathering his folder, Voss saying something about the shipping numbers. "Mr. Teller," Marlene said. "I'm the operator on number 4. You'll want to see the line running before it's tidied for you. It's this way, the short way." She said it flat. She said it like a thing already arranged, and there is a trick to that voice, she'd learned it in 22 years. The voice that makes a hurried man follow, because refusing takes more thought than agreeing. Teller looked at her 1/2 second. Something in him woke up, some old inspector instinct that had spent all morning waiting to be managed and had just been offered the opposite. "Lead on," he said. Behind them, Voss's chair scraped. "Now, hold on, Ray. There's a proper route," but they were already down the first 3 steps, and a man does not run down his own office stairs after a state inspector without looking like exactly what he is. She took Teller the short way, past receiving, past the wash sink. Down the aisle Voss hadn't repainted because Voss never thought anyone would see it. And she didn't say a word against the company. Not one. That was the whole of it. She'd decided weeks ago she wouldn't hand this man a grievance. She'd hand him a machine. She stopped at number 4. It was running. The ram came down and the Delmark blank came out. And it came out fast. Faster than a guarded press has any business cycling, and a man who'd spent his life in inspection would feel that in his teeth before he understood it. "This is the Delmark order," Marlene said. "Point of operation setups right there. I'd like you to look at it yourself, Mr. Teller, not my word." "Yours." Teller set his case down on the floor. He leaned in. He was quiet a long moment, and the press ran, and Marlene stood with her hands folded in front of her apron and did not help him. She wanted him to find it. Found is worth 10 of told. He found it. "These palm buttons," Teller said slowly. "They're bolted through the plate." He put a thumb on one. He pressed it. Nothing changed. The ram kept its rhythm off the foot trip, the single cycle, the fast way. He pressed the other. Nothing. He straightened up, and his face had gone very still. "They're not wired to anything. This guard's a dummy. The machine's cycling with no point of operation protection at all." "Yes," said Marlene. "Just that." And then she did the thing she'd carried in her chest for 41 days. She turned to her toolbox at the end of the line. She lifted the tray. She took out the bundle wrapped in a shop rag, and she unwound the rag, slow. And there it was, the real guard. The steel one she'd cut and bolted herself back after the scare in '68. The one she'd fished out of the scrap barrel with her own 2 hands because there was no sense letting good steel rust. She laid it on the die. "Right there, on the tool, in front of him. That's the guard that belongs on this press," she said. "I built it. It came off 6 weeks back to save 2 seconds a cycle. I kept it. Figured somebody ought to be able to hold the real thing in his hand." Teller looked at the guard on the die. He looked at the dummy bolted to the machine. He looked at the press, running the big order fast and bare. And then he reached into his own case and took out a red tag, and he hung it on number 4, and he reached over and he brought the line down himself. The press stopped. In the sudden quiet, you could hear the ventilators. You could hear men 3 aisles over turn their heads. That was when Voss got there. He came fast down the aisle and then made himself slow the last few steps. And he arrived all charm, the folder still in his hand, his voice smooth as a floor manager's voice gets when the floor is on fire. Ray, I'm sorry. She pulled you off before I could. Look, that guard, that's a maintenance item. We had it scheduled. It's coming off the board for repair this week. I've got the work order upstairs. Do you?" Teller said. "I do. It's an oversight, is what it is. A scheduling thing. You know how it goes, a busy floor, and for a beat it held. That's the thing nobody tells you." For 1 beat, the lie was good enough. Voss had the voice and the suit and the home ground, and Teller was 1 man with a red tag, and a scheduled repair is a story that has saved 100 plants. Marlene felt it wobble, felt the whole thing lean toward the exit Voss had built. Then Teller said the sentence she'd been praying he'd say. "Show me the maintenance log." The charm didn't leave Voss's face all at once. It left it in pieces. The log's up in. That'd be in the office. I'd have to. It's here," said a voice. Otis Lund came out of the aisle. He had the book under his arm the way he'd carried it for 30 years. He walked up to the die past Voss, and he did the thing he'd spent his whole careful life not doing. He set the logbook down on the tool, right next to the guard, and he opened it to the page, and he ran one thick finger down to the line in his own hand. "Guard came off number 4 here," Otis said. "Same day off 2 and off 7. By written order, that's the date." He didn't look at Voss. He looked at Teller. 41 days ago. There's no repair order because it wasn't a repair. It was a pull. To make cycle time. The floor was very quiet. Voss stood there with his folder, and you could watch the ground go out from under him. The whole staged morning, the coffee gone cold up in the glass office, the clean aisles, the fresh paint, all of it useless now, because the one thing he'd been sure of was the only thing that had ever mattered to a man like him. He controlled the paper. He'd always controlled the paper. He'd dropped Marlene's report in the trash in front of 3 people, because paper you can bury. And it had never once occurred to him that a woman on press 4 would bury nothing, and instead just wait, and hand the whole truth to the state in the one form he couldn't touch, the machine itself, running, witnessed, with the honest log open beside it. Teller closed the book gently and handed it back to Otis. "I'll want a copy of that page," he said. "And I'll be looking at 2 and 7. He turned to Voss. "As of right now, all 3 of those presses are down. Nothing runs on a red tag. Not one stroke." "You can't," Voss started. "I can," Teller said. "That's the whole reason they sent me. The red tags went up before noon. All 3. A boy from maintenance walked them down the line with Teller behind him, and one by one the presses went dark, and the Delmark order, the $380,000 order with 30 days to run and only 22 of them gone, stopped cold on day 23. The line just quit. The big stampings sat half done in their bins. And Harlan Voss stood in the middle of his own floor and watched his production die, killed by the 2 seconds a cycle he'd stolen to save it. He found Marlene an hour later. She was cleaning her station. She always cleaned her station. He came up close so his voice wouldn't carry, and the charm was all gone now, and what was left was just the cold underneath it. "You're finished here," Voss said. "You understand that. Whatever you think you did. You're done in this plant." Marlene didn't stop wiping down the die. She didn't raise her voice. She never once, in the whole of it, raised her voice. "Maybe," she said. And then she set down her rag, and she walked past him, not around him, past him, the way you pass a thing that stopped mattering, and she went to where Raymond Teller stood writing on his clipboard, and she said, "There's more you should hear. 6 weeks back I filed a formal report on this machine. Named the number. Named the danger. Mr. Voss took it and dropped it in the wastebasket by the receiving desk. There were 3 people watching when he did it. The clerk's right there. 2 men were on break by the door." Teller looked up. "They'd say so?" "Ask them." He asked them. The receiving clerk, a careful woman who'd kept her head down for years, looked at the red tags on the presses and found her spine and said yes, she'd seen it, she'd seen Mr. Voss drop the report in the trash and say paper doesn't run the press. The 2 men on break said the same, 3 witnesses. The account Marlene had opened the day her report hit the trash finally came due, and it came due with interest. Because a buried report doesn't stay buried when the thing it warned about is standing there, red-tagged for the whole floor to see. The citation came down under the new law. Marlene never saw the paperwork itself, that was Teller's to carry, but she saw what it did. And the first thing it did was save Danny Corso. Because the plant's whole story had been operator error. That was the file. Danny single-cycled it wrong, the paperwork said. Danny's own hands. Danny's own fault. And that line would have followed the kid the rest of his working life. Marked him as a warning. ended his trade before it started. But you cannot write operator error on a machine that the state has just red-tagged for having no operator protection at all. The machine itself contradicted the file. You can't lose 2 fingers to your own carelessness on a press the inspector has certified was running bare and fast and wrong. The file collapsed under its own machine. Danny's comp form went back up the line with the operator error language struck, and it got signed the honest way, and the kid's record came out clean. 2 weeks after that, the men who owned Ashford Stamping came down from wherever owners live. They came because of the fine, and because of the lost Delmark contract, and because a state citation under a brand new safety law is the kind of thing that gets read aloud in rooms where money sits. And they held their review right there on the shop floor, because that was where the mess was, and because there's an old cruelty in making a man answer on the ground he ruled. They stood Harlan Voss in front of the same presses, in front of the same clerk, in front of Marlene, who did not say much, because she didn't need to anymore. They asked Voss to explain the pulled guards. And Voss did what men like him always do. He explained. He talked about schedules, about the Delmark deadline, about the pressures of the order, about how everyone knew the guards slowed the cycle and the customer needed the parts and somebody had to make the hard call. He talked and talked, and every sentence he offered to save himself was one more nail, because what the owners heard was a man calmly describing exactly why he'd stripped the safety off 3 machines and put his people in front of them for money. His justification was his sentence. Nobody had to shout. Nobody did. The quietest room Marlene ever stood in was the one where Harlan Voss talked himself out of his own job. They let him go that afternoon. Not loud. Just done. She thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. There was still the cherry, and it came a month on, and it came the way she'd never have guessed. Voss came back. He came to the plant on a Tuesday, in a suit that didn't fit the place anymore, and he found her on the floor, and he had a piece of paper in his hand. Of course he did. Paper was the only weapon he'd ever understood. It was a statement, typed neat, and it said that the whole thing had been a misunderstanding, an unfortunate lapse, no ill intent, and it had a line at the bottom for her signature. Sign this, and his reference stood. Sign this, and maybe the next plant took him. Sign this, and the story got soft. You and I both know it got out of hand, Voss said. Nobody meant for the boy to get hurt. Just sign it, Marlene. Let it be a misunderstanding. I'd do the same for you. Marlene looked at the paper. She looked at the man. Then she looked down the line to number 4, still red-tagged, still dark, waiting on the repair that was finally actually scheduled. You want to talk about paper, she said. All right. Here's my price. Bolt Danny's guard back on yourself. The real one, out of my toolbox, in front of the floor, with your own 2 hands where every man here can watch you do it. Then we'll talk about paper. Voss stared at her. For a second the old contempt flickered up, and then it went out, because he had nowhere left to carry it, and he understood that this was the only door out of the room she was going to give him. He took off his suit coat. He rolled his sleeves. Marlene lifted the tray in her toolbox and took out the bundle in the shop rag, and she unwound it. And she handed him the guard she'd built in '68 and fished out of the scrap barrel and laid on the die for the inspector. And Harlan Voss, in front of the whole floor, on his knees at number 4, bolted the safety guard back onto the press he'd stripped it off. Nobody clapped. Marlene wouldn't have wanted them to. When he was done, he stood up and looked at her. Waiting. They never did talk about paper. She just took the statement out of his hand, folded it once, and dropped it in the wastebasket by the receiving desk. Same basket. She let him watch it land. Paper doesn't run the press, Harlan, she said. Then she turned back to her work. Spring came to Kettle Falls the way it always did, slow and then all at once. By the March of 1972, the maples on the road out to the plant had gone that first raw green, and the mornings smelled of wet ground instead of cold iron, and number 4 ran again. It ran right this time. The real guard was bolted on where it belonged, and somebody, Otis, she suspected, though he never owned it, had painted it safety yellow so bright you could see it from the far door. The palm buttons were live under her hands. You had to hit both at once, hands clear of the die, before the ram would come down. It cost 2 seconds a cycle. Marlene had come to love those 2 seconds. They were the 2 seconds a machine takes to make sure the person running it still has all their fingers when it's done. Danny Corso stood at the press beside her, running the setup she'd taught him. He was 2 fingertips short on his right hand, and he'd learned to work around it, the way machinists always learn to work around the pieces the trade takes off them. He was certified now. Back at his bench, his record clean, his trade intact, a kid who'd nearly become a warning and instead became a machinist. He caught her watching him, and he grinned. Quick, the way her husband's prot used to grin, and she looked back at her own work, so he wouldn't see it land on her. Over by the time clock there was a shelf. And on the shelf sat the old guard, the scrap barrel guard, the one that had ridden in her toolbox for 41 days and gone on to the die in front of a state inspector and come back out to be bolted on by the man who'd thrown it away. It didn't run anything now, it just sat there. Otis had made a little plaque for it out of a scrap of brass, and he'd stamped it by hand. And it didn't say anything grand. It just gave the date. Every man clocking in ran his eye over it without thinking, the way you touch a doorframe on your way through. Somebody asked her once, that spring, whatever happened to Voss. Marlene thought about it a second, wiping down her die. Heard he's managing something, she said. Not much. Not anymore. And that was all she ever said about him. She'd learned a thing, in the autumn of 1971, that she carried into every shift after. She'd always believed the written truth was enough. Write it down, name the machine, file it clean, and the truth would hold. But she'd watched a man drop her truth in a wastebasket like it was nothing. Because paper you can bury, and a man who controls the files controls the record. That was the lesson that nearly cost Danny his hand and his trade both. Some truths you can't file. Some truths won't fit on a page, or fit and get thrown away. Those truths you can't hand a man on paper. You have to stand him in front of the thing itself, running, in the room where it lives, and let him see it with his own eyes. A witnessed machine can't be buried. A guard you can hold in your hand can't be edited out of the record. She hadn't beaten Voss with a better document. She'd beaten him by refusing to make it a document at all. The ram came down. The part came out. Danny's press answered hers a half-beat behind, the 2 yellow guards bright in the morning light, coming through the high windows, and the floor moved the way a good floor moves. And Marlene Kovak ran number 4 the way she'd run it for 22 years, with all her fingers and a clear conscience and 2 good seconds a cycle to spare. Tell me the town you're watching from. The oil smell was the same as it had always been, that particular mix of cutting fluid and hot metal and the dust that collected in the rafters and never quite came down. She knew it the way you know your own kitchen in the dark. The press vibrated up through the soles of her boots, up through her knees, into her hips, and she felt it the way she always had, not as noise, but as conversation. The machine telling her what it was doing, whether the stroke was clean, whether the material was feeding right, whether everything was as it should be. It was as it should be. The morning light shifted across the floor in long pale bars. A forklift moved somewhere behind her. Someone laughed, short and low, over by the surface grinder. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary shift, and she was inside them, part of them, the way she had always been. 22 years on the same floor. She knew where the draft came from in January. She knew which overhead light flickered when it rained. She knew the particular tone the presses made when they were cold, and the different tone they made when they'd warmed through, and she trusted that difference, the way you trust a person who has never once lied to you. The ram came down again. Clean, the guard sat bright and yellow on the die, doing what it was built to do, holding the line between a good shift and a bad one. She ran her count. She breathed. She stayed.